Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the Doctor Who novelizations put out by Target Books from 1973 onward in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. And this week we are going off the boards and not reading a Target. Instead, I'd like to welcome you to my library, my improbable library, if you will. Since November 2021, in 2 weeks we'll hit this podcast's 3-year anniversary, I have taken you through my library of Target novelizations, one by one each week. We are currently in the middle of 1988, the year that I was 14, going on 15, when my 3 biggest obsessions were Doctor Who, New York Mets baseball, and girls, but not necessarily in that order. I'd been a Doctor Who fan for about 3.5 years by that point, and had seen every then available broadcast story from the first 22 seasons. I was starting to cool on the show, but was still collecting Targets as they came out, and was still reading them faithfully, if not as often as I'd been reading them a year or two earlier. But while just about every UK-based guest who's appeared on this podcast discovered Doctor Who at just about the time they were learning to read, I discovered Doctor Who over 6 years after I'd learned to read, and I accumulated a lot of reading material and a lot of obsessions long before the TARDIS landed on my horizons. I lost most of that material over the years, but thanks to the electronic miracle of eBay, I've gotten most of it back. And that's why this week, we're going to be walking through my library of improbable books, the books that directly or indirectly made me the Doctor Who fan that I am today.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
The first book I ever read was Anna Karenina, the Russian novel. It was the summer of 1978, and I was a few weeks away from starting kindergarten, a few months away from turning 5 years old. My parents largely did not come from money. Both came from immigrant parents. They were born during World War II, and the 70s were marked by the scarcity mindset, even at the best of times. One thing I never lacked for, though, was books, either purchased for me or via frequent trips to the public library in our Long Island suburb. I never lacked for reading material. Or for TV, let's not forget. Over-the-air VHF channels in the New York area those days ranged from 2 to 13. 3 networks, CBS on 2, NBC on 4, ABC on 7. 3 syndicated stations, Metro Media Channel 5, later acquired by Fox, WOR on 9, WPIX on 11. There was PBS on Channel 13, as Billy Joel name-checked in the song Pressure, and the forbidden fruit of cable TV, pirated in my childhood bedroom on the 13-inch black and white TV set, so I could watch Mets baseball, or Islanders hockey on Channel 3, Sports Channel, or Peanuts movies when they aired on HBO Channel 6. But this episode is not about my plentiful TV habits before Doctor Who came along. This episode is about books. The funny part of that one sentence of Anna Karenina is that it's the only sentence from that book I've ever read. My mother would have been in her mid-30s that summer. She devoured Anna Karenina, sitting in the backyard, catching the summer sun, and reading her Russian novel from the public library. I came wandering over and read a complete sentence over her shoulder. That's the first time my parents saw me reading out loud. I was not quite 5, not even in formal school yet. Don't ask me which sentence I read in Anna Karenina. This is not a Russian novels podcast, unless enough of you write in and ask me to turn this show into Dr. Zhivago literature. Then I'll read Russian novels. The earliest books I read in full would have been the books my parents read to me nightly. Too many to mention. Very few I have left in my possession. But here's the most important one, The King by Dick Bruna. Dick Bruna a Dutch author and illustrator, among other accomplishments, who lived all the way up to 2017, passing away at age 89 years young. The King was a hand-me-down for my cousin Jonathan, 4 years older than me, and the only other member of my extended family who still lives in Brooklyn, everyone else having died or moved away. Jonathan received the book as a birthday present from his friend Edward, according to the inscription on the inside cover, July 1972. Of course, they would have been 3 years old at the time, so I assume Edward did not write the inscription himself. Fun fact, Jonathan and Edward are still friends over half a century later. Edward lived near us in Brooklyn until recently. Our kids went to neighboring public schools, and he once, through an act of chutzpah in a foreign hotel lobby, talked his way into the crew of a Spike Lee movie. But when I started to read, Jonathan's mother gave me Jonathan's outgrown books, including The King. I cannot overstate that The King is still one of the greatest books I've ever read. It's a small square of dark blue cloth hardcover with all the illustrations in simple shapes and bold colors. The King of the title has a red circle face and a simple three-pointed golden crown. Written in 1964, it's the simple tale of a boy king looked after by, quote, two tall, thin green ladies, until he falls in love with the gardener's daughter, Rose. He's not allowed to marry Rose because she's not royalty, but at the end, the king takes off his crown, declaring, I do not want to be a king, I'd rather play a game. There are 12 pages of text, made up of rhyming couplets. The last page shows the now crownless king with the raven-haired Rose, whose face is also red, both smiling at the reader and wearing simple yellow smocks, hers with a yellow collar, his with a white turtleneck. Quote, now every day the king and Rose play and run and swing. Having a friend is wonderful. It's better than being a king. Taken literally, I'm not sure this is a good message. I don't know Dick Bruna's politics. This sounds a bit like Edward the King and Wallace Simpson to me. Not that I'm accusing the King's Rose of being a Nazi sympathizer. My lawyer work ethic doesn't permit me to rather play a game instead of work. The existence of this podcast to the contrary. But the pictures are gorgeous in their simplicity, and the poetry of the sparse text is easy to memorize, making this a book I could read and recite from memory long before I could decipher the words for myself. What I did not know, for decades, is that The King is not an English language book. It's translated from the original Dutch. Now that fact is revealed on the copyright page, but I would not have been reading that in the late 70s. When Callie was first being introduced to children's books recorded for YouTube videos, she would have been 2 or so, I found the Dutch text of the book, not the English, recorded and sung, with guitar accompaniment, by some Dutch dad in the early 80s. It's a gorgeous bit of guitar work, which is one dad skill I don't have. Sadly, the video is no longer on YouTube, but I did download it several years ago. Let's give a brief listen.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Er woonde eens een jongetje in een paleis van glas. En aan zijn kroontje kon je zien dat hij een koning was. 2 dunne groene dametjes die zorgden goed voor hem. Zij maakten broodjes voor hem klaar met kaas en ook met jam. De koning had een blokkendoos.
Thank you, anonymous, unknown Dutch father. I once, on a day off, copied out the Dutch book text from the video and Google translated it back into English. The English translation, come to find out, varies quite a bit from the original. The princess that the tall, green ladies want the king, der koning, to marry, has long and golden hair in English, but a crown as green as grass in the Dutch text. All that aside, I rediscovered this book in the early 90s while moving to college. I once read it to a college girlfriend. She made fun of me for misting up when I reached the end. When we took our family vacation to Amsterdam in 2019, different girlfriend, we shopped at an outdoor market. Callie found the original Dutch version of the book, was very excited to show me, so we bought it. The two copies now live side by side on Callie's shelves, and one day I hope she reads them to her kids. The other books that I couldn't have my parents read to me enough were Ant and Bee, a tiny series of pamphlet-sized hardcovers by a British writer under the pen name Angela Banner. I never owned these, strictly borrowed from the library, but I did buy 2 copies on eBay, which survive among Callie's bookshelves. The books take Ant and Bee on a series of increasingly unusual journeys around the world, always encountering new words and always in alphabetical order, including words that wouldn't have made a lot of sense to me in the late 70s, like plasticine or Q-U-E-U-E. Ant is a red ant, Bee is fat and furry and appears to be wearing glasses, always dressed in bizarre hats, Ant favoring floppy yellow, and Bee in what appears to be the business end of a Dalek sink plunger. These books do not do for my emotions what The King does, but they were the first book series with which I was fairly obsessed, long before the Targets. Chances are you already know Little Golden Books, which have been in continuous publication since 1942. Still in publication, albeit now absorbed by Penguin Random House, their Taylor Swift title last year, in 2023, became their fastest-selling title ever, 1 million copies in 7 months. I had a bunch of these, and for Callie, we had all these Star Wars Golden Book adaptations several years ago. My favorite, when I was a preschooler, was The Lively Little Rabbit, written in 1943, the second year of the line, written by Ariane, the pen name of Georges Duplay, and illustrated by Gustave Tenggren, who had been a chief illustrator on Disney's first movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. For Little Golden Books the year before, Tenggren had illustrated The Pokey Little Puppy, which was for decades the best-selling hardcover children's book of all time. Of all time. Not exactly a lightweight, our friend Tenggren. The Lively Little Rabbit is the story of the title rabbit trying to evade the mean old weasel who eats rabbits for breakfast. The rabbit decides to fight back with the help of a red squirrel and a wise owl. Together, they cosplay as a dragon, which frightens the weasel, who on the last page moves away from the woods and, quote, never again has he tried to eat a lively little rabbit for breakfast. I have little memory of this, but I would have been 3 or 4 when it happened. My father says he got home one day when his mother, my grandmother, was babysitting, and we had set up an elaborate tableau in the house to represent the dragon, me, and my grandmother, fighting back against that mean old weasel. There's not much I can learn from this book now, at age 51, and I hardly remember reading it in the late 70s, but it is a classic of the children's book genre, and one day I hope to see my grandchildren act out that dragon scene. After Little Golden Books came comics. Now Ross Aitken from Gallifrey's Most Wanted, and a frequent guest on this show, has a great comics podcast, Stop, Let's Team Up. And I wish I had but a fraction of his encyclopedic memory, or his massive comics collection, but in the late 70s and early 80s, that was my peak comics collecting age. I had the 3 main brands. Marvel, of course. Spider-Man was my very first favorite comic book superhero, thanks to that late 60s cartoon theme song, still in heavy rotation on syndicated TV in New York in the late 70s.
Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. Spins a web any size, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got radio.
And Spider-Man was identifiably a New York City kid, like me. DC, with Superman's Metropolis and Batman's Gotham City being pretty much NYC surrogates, those were also favorites. And Whitman Comics, which had the Walt Disney license. I collected all 3 of these lines equally, Marvel, DC, Whitman, My mother, to this day, still talks about how impressed she was when I would organize my comics into separate piles by publisher at age 4. Looking around my house now, boy do I wish I still had those organizational skills. My most prized possession at age 4 and 5 was the Walt Disney Comics Digest, put out by Gold Key. That was one of Whitman's trade names. It's the December 1975 issue. The front cover pictures all the Disney favorites: Mickey, Pluto, Goofy, Donald and Daisy Duck, Uncle Scrooge, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, among others. On the back was an ad for other licensed characters under the same publisher: Bugs Bunny, Woody Woodpecker, Sylvester and Tweety, the Pink Panther, that's the licensed cartoon character spun off from the Peter Sellers films, and other characters whose names I don't recall because they have not stood the test of time. I would have read this book over and over, 132 pages of comics and puzzles, for a good few years, until one day I brought it out with me to a restaurant for lunch and left it behind in the booth in childish error. I did track down the issue on eBay in 2023. It took a lot of Googling to find the specific issue that I would have had and lost, and in true Twilight Zone ironic twist, I found that my eyesight had degenerated to the point where I could barely read that tiny 1975 print. Now I am on a stronger prescription now, and I can read the stories again, but sadly, they're not much to write home about. My father worships at the altar of Carl Barks, the quote, good duck artist who brought Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge around the world and across time to the most fantastical adventures. This collection has no Carl Barks in it. You can get Carl Barks' work elsewhere in expensive hardbound collections, and those are worth every penny. But instead, this book has a bunch of very, very dated offensive stereotypes, like, I swear I'm not making this up, Little Hiawatha, and you don't want me to read for you the dialogue that Little Hiawatha and his chief talk. I must have been too young to read even when I was first given this digest, so I suspect most of what I loved about it was the pictures. There are 16 stories in this issue, but 3 of them are a connected serial, Mickey Mouse in the Threat of the Stone Eaters, spread across the book. Come on, Big Finish, get the license for this, and make a lush 75-minute audio out of the Threat of the Stone Eaters. I remember not a one story from the late 70s, but looking at the cover illustration still gives me that same rush of pleasure that I would have had as a preschooler reading this book from cover to cover over and over again. Now, I've mentioned Gold Key Comics. They were the name in licensed comics in the 60s and 70s, with hard forays into the science fiction series that I still love today. They had long-running lines of comics for Star Trek, The Twilight Zone, Dark Shadows. Now, I suspect having the license was more important to them than the quality of the stories, many of which are awful. I bought their Star Trek line on DVD-ROM back when the first J.J. Abrams Trek movie came out, but I gave up very early on in a publication order read-through after Spock ordered the genocide of a race of carnivorous alien plants in one of the first stories. But, in all fairness to Gold Key, their titles sold and sold and sold. But it turns out I was coming in to Walt Disney Comics Digest at the end. What I have is the penultimate issue. December 1975, only one more after that, so I have issue 56 out of 57. Western Publishing, which ran Gold Key and Whitman, went out of business in 1984, coincidentally the year I turned to Doctor Who. The Gold Key book that I have is a digest, but under the Whitman name they sold standard issue comic books. My dad called them joke books, and those were my reward for good grades or seasonal presents. The biggest pleasure for me was when Whitman moved their comics off the comics and magazine racks and newsstands in candy stores and sold their books in toy stores in sealed bags of 3 at a time. 3 comics in one package? Mind-blowing for your less discerning 9-year-old reader. And there were lots of Donald Duck and Chip and Dale adventures to be found within. Now for the Jewish holiday of Passover, you observe what's called a Seder. The word means order, which is a hours-long dinner and retelling of the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt under the guidance of Moses, who in turn got his guidance from the man upstairs. This is best known through the 1960 film version of the Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston and Edward G. Robinson, who once danced with my grandmother at a fundraiser, Yvonne DiCarlo from the Munsters, and the great Yul Brynner. But that's the Christianized version of the story, as directed by Cecil B. DeMille. The operating text for the Seder is called the Haggadah. That's a Hebrew text with American translation alongside, which has dozens of songs embedded within, and follows a ritual of prayers and drinking 4 cups of wine and breaking for the quote-unquote festive meal, finished with a string of songs, which when you're a kid, way up past your bedtime, surrounded by adults buzzed on 4 glasses of Manischewitz, take on very disturbing tones. One of the songs from the end of the Seder is called Had Gad Yah, One Little Goat. It's the story of a father who buys a goat, and there's just a succession of deadly encounters with larger and larger animals killing each other until the angel of death shows up in the penultimate verse, and then the Holy One, blessed be he, shows up in the final verse. This song sounds like a kid's song with a lot of repetition, but it does have multiple prophecy interpretations. The Passover Seder is an experience. It's the one element of Judaism where you are encouraged to bring outsiders to your table, to tell them the story. Now when Quentin Tarantino, and in all fairness, Quentin's book, Cinema Speculation, is very much an inspiration for this episode of Doctor Who Literature. It is Tarantino narrating his childhood and adolescence through the movies he saw, with surprisingly harsh opinions about certain inoffensive actors and directors. When Tarantino was making his Jewish World War II Soldiers vs. the Nazis movie, he wanted some help getting into the Jewish mindset, so Eli Roth, who was in the cast, invited him to the Roth family home for Passover Seder, Roth telling Tarantino something to the effect of, "We still get together once a year to tell a story from 3,000 years ago, and we're still angry about what happened." In fact, Ben Stiller makes a similar remark to Ben Kingsley in one of the Night at the Museum movies.
I'm half Irish, half Jewish. So
You are? I love Jews. We owned 40,000 of them.
Such lovely people.
Here we go.
They were very happy, always singing with the candles.
Yeah, they really weren't happy.
Really?
No, they left. They spent about 40 years in the desert trying to escape.
Oh.
Yeah, we have dinner once a year and talk about it. It's a big deal.
But for me, growing up, the key part of the Seder was not the songs and not the food. By the way, Eli Roth, if you're listening, please invite me to the next Roth family Seder. But there's a children's game worked into the text, the finding of the afikomen, which is a bit of matzah. That's the unleavened bread, the only food Moses was able to take with the Hebrews as they escaped from Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. The afikomen is hidden somewhere in the house. The first child to find it wins a prize. When I won in the early 80s, my prize was a 3-pack of Whitman joke books. Now, we still play the afikomen game at Doctor Who Literature Family Seders, but Whitman went out of business in 1984. It turns out that the 3-pack of comics was a terrible idea. You see, Western Publishing was bought out by Mattel, the toy manufacturers, in 1979, and the bagged comics were Mattel's idea. They just didn't sell, and that was the end of Western Publishing. And then, after the joke books, comes, yes, Batman. I was given my first 2 Batman comics in 1979. I read them dozens of times each, and then lost them, only to buy them again at New York Comic Con in 2019. This episode, by the way, comes out Comic Con weekend 2024, though I didn't go this year. I had issues 314 and 319 of the original Batman series, both written by the great Len Wein. 314 features Two-Face, 319 features the Gentleman Ghost. You can imagine to my youthful worldview that these were the 2 preeminent Batman villains, because that was all I knew in 1979, the contents of those 2 issues. Then I came to the 1966 Batman on syndicated TV, Metro Media, Channel 5, where I met the rest of the rogues gallery of guest villains, the Joker, the Riddler, the Catwoman, Mr. Freeze, and then Van Johnson's Curious the Minstrel. Channel 5 aired Batman weekdaily at 4 p.m., except I had to attend Hebrew school at 4 p.m. on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I only ever saw part 1 of the 2-part Batman episodes, and it was decades before I saw some of those cliffhangers resolve. The Penguin running for mayor? Batman about to say I do to Catwoman? The Minstrel turning Batman and Robin over cooking spits, cooking them alive? Every other day I'd watch Batman get into trouble, and the next day I'd be sitting in Hebrew school, nominally learning about my culture and mother tongue, but really wondering, how did Batman escape the Minstrel? But Gentleman Ghost, as it turns out, is just not all that, and, spoilers, not even a ghost. Len Wein is one of the comic book writers. His Batman in 1979 is not a billionaire. Before the great plunder of wealth, that was Reaganomics, and the Great Recession, and the COVID pandemic. This Bruce Wayne is merely a millionaire. Wein's prose style tells you who Batman is, just on the splash page alone. Issue 319, Never Give Up the Ghost. Quote, the night is filled with sound and fury for those who know how to listen. Listen closely, and you can hear the low, sad rumble of thunder on the horizon, the soft, stealthy tread of trespassing footsteps, the faint click of safe tumblers being teased to reveal their secrets, and the audible gasp that rises from the gathered thieves when a sudden stroke of lightning reveals the Batman. I was only 6 when I got those 2 issues. Given the timing, I would suspect it was a birthday present. I would have been in 1st grade. I didn't realize I was getting a Shakespeare quote and or William Faulkner with my stories. At a charity ball in this issue, attendees dress up as President Lincoln, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and of course Wein is the writer who created Lucius Fox, who appears along with Selina Kyle in these stories. But you don't just read a 1979 comic book for the prose, or story, or art, or cultural allusions. You read it for the ads. Comic book ads were just as much my education as what I was learning from Mrs. Siegel in 1st grade or from Mrs. Zucker in Hebrew school. Race car toys and plastic figures are sold within these pages, and Hostess cupcakes and fruit pies. The Flash appears in an ad disguised as a story called The Stony-Eyed Medusa, and the tagline, if you know it, say it along with me, you get a big delight in every bite of Hostess fruit pies and cupcakes. There was Hubba Bubba Bubblegum, which gives you a full-page tutorial on how an 8-year-old boy with a fashionable bowl haircut, and yes, I had one of those, can dress like a cowboy while blowing a bubble big enough to obscure his face. Now, Star Wars may have awarded their comics license to Marvel. Roy Thomas's script for the 6-episode adaptation of the 1977 movie is, to this day, I hold, better than Lucas's own, but here they have a 2-page ad spread for all the action figures and toys and sets. Now, I have all the action figures, even Snaggletooth and the Power Droid, Walrus Man, Hammerhead. This is back when letter writers had their home addresses printed in the papers. From time to time, you'll recognize a name in the letter's pages. I once had a love interest whose dad wrote to Marvel in the mid-60s, but I don't know anyone who wrote into this issue, Batman 319, but there is an exhortation to sell grit newspapers, which I never did, and there's a back cover ad for Lego, which confounded me in 1979 as I hadn't the manual dexterity to assemble full sets, a skill which fortunately I have long since conquered. Now the ads in Batman 314, Once Beaten, Twice Sly, also by Wein, which introduced me to Two-Face and New Orleans and Mardi Gras, has a full-color ad on the inside cover featuring O.J. Simpson in cartoon form selling sneakers. Whoops, that didn't age well. Opposite page 8 is an ad for baseball cards printed on Hostess cupcakes and Twinkies boxes. I started collecting baseball cards at around that age too. and my old WordPress Doctor Who novels blog made a point of including a photo of any 1979 Topps baseball card that had a player name matching a Doctor Who character, like Dennis Eckersley or Craig Swan. Opposite page 10 is a full-page ad of Pete Rose, an iconic late 70s powder blue Philadelphia Phillies road jersey, selling a licensed batting tee. Now that is aged even worse than the OJ ad. Rose died a couple of weeks before I record this. Rose was an admitted statutory rapist and a degenerate gambler, baseball's all-time hit leader, but also banned from its Hall of Fame. Issue 314, in a less offensive ad, sells sea monkeys, which my parents would never buy for me. Now, I no longer have it, but I did once own a single issue of Marvel's late 70s Star Wars book. I begged my mom to let me join the Star Wars fan club, advertised in its pages, until we realized that I was reading a back issue, and the fan club offer had expired 2 years earlier. Now, I do have the Marvel Omnibus trade paperback of the Star Wars comic. I no longer recall which issue, except issues 7 and 8, following on the 6-episode Roy Thomas movie adaptation, are a direct ripoff of the Magnificent Seven, which of course itself is a remake of Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai. Terrance Dicks said it best, you have to start with a good idea, but it needn't be your good idea. Before we leave the comics, we'll turn over to Superman. My first Superman issue was 343, The Last Days of Metropolis, which features a sorcerer villain who escaped the eruption of Pompeii, the title being an allusion to the old movie, The Last Days of Pompeii. This was exactly 2,000 years after the volcano erupted. The issue was published October 1979 for a January 1980 street date, the same month as Len Wein's Batman 319, and again probably my 6th birthday present. This Superman was written by Denny O'Neil and penciled by Curt Swan, so I was learning from the best. I no longer have this issue, except by PDF. Superman was light comedy back in those days, but issue 343 stands well above the other stories in the months before and after it. What I do have today is a special Superman issue called The Computers That Saved Metropolis, and it says compliments of Radio Shack, quote, the biggest name in little computers, in a balloon on the cover. This is not a regular Superman issue like 343. This was an advertising gimmick to sell TRS-80 computers, which were usually known as Trash 80s for their limited capabilities. I did buy my first computer from Radio Shack in 1989, probably still under the influence of this issue. But this is not, and you can be forgiven for thinking, a mere advertising throwaway. This is a full, proper Superman comic, written by Cary Bates and penciled by Jim Starlin and Dick Giordano. Bates wrote Superman longer than anyone. He also wrote the late 80s Superboy live-action TV series, and he co-wrote the Alexander and Ilya Salkind movie about Christopher Columbus, probably the last bit of pop culture to ever show Columbus in even a faintly positive light. That movie basically ended the Salkinds as producers, and Marlon Brando's role as Torquemada is, shall we say, not his best efforts. Starlin and Giordano are also premier names in the comics of that era. The Computers That Saved Metropolis features Supes using the programming help of two plucky New York City public school kids. Well, Metropolis kids, but it's clearly New York, which is where DC was headquartered at the time. My parents were New York City school teachers, and that's how I've always received it. These two plucky kids use their TRS-80s to solve physics problems that help a kryptonite-addled Superman defeat the bad guy of the week. This is a remarkable historical document. DC literally put its best writers and artists of the era to sell crummy Radio Shack PCs, but it's a full-size story with a trip to the moon, falling airplanes, a history of computing, and a masked villain. I grew up at a great time for comics. Len Wein, by the way, also wrote for Marvel and for Disney and for Gold Key. So if there is a theme, to this episode of Doctor Who Literature. It is that Len Wein casts a shadow over nearly all of my Improbable library. Well, not all my library. We still have to talk about baseball, and let's do that after the break.
You are invited on an adventure across all of time and space, in a completely random order. It's the Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. Jump in the TARDIS with your hosts,
Eric Gulbranson,
Asad Kheshki,
and
Matthew Kressel.
Explore Doctor Who TV stories, audio adventures, and books, both novels and non-fiction. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast. It's the entire Whoniverse on shuffle. The Police Box in the Junkyard podcast is a member of the Direction Point Network and is available about once a month wherever you find your podcasts. You are listening to the Doctor Who Literature podcast.
I became aware of baseball in the late 70s, as my dad would watch the Yankees games on WPIX, Channel 11, every night between April and October. Frank Messer, Bill White, and Phil the Scooter Rizzuto were the broadcasters who taught me baseball. I didn't become a fan myself until 1981, when I discovered that I was sad that baseball went off the air due to a summer-long strike that wiped out 50 of the planned 162 regular season games for each team. The Yanks and Dodgers met in the World Series that year, and as I record this, the Yankees have just clinched a berth to the World Series, and the Dodgers, if they beat the Mets one more time, will also join the Yankees in the World Series for a rematch of that fateful 1981 season. The game has massively changed in the last 43 years. The Dodgers are now owned by billionaire basketball legend Magic Johnson, and their best player, Shohei Ohtani, was several years away from being born in 1981. In terms of my Improbable library, I came to baseball really with the June 1979 issue of Baseball Digest, the present from my Uncle Herb, who took me to a candy store in my neighborhood. Candy stores like that don't really exist anymore, I don't think. But the Baseball Digest back then was square-bound, similar in size and shape to my Walt Disney issue mentioned above, found on the candy store's newsstands. The cover photo was of brawny, four-armed Los Angeles Dodgers first baseman Steve Garvey. As history would have it, Garvey is still alive and is right now the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate in a race against Adam Schiff, taking place on Election Day next month, 2024. For an open seat vacated by the late centrist Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein. Died last year, by the way. She was the person who discovered the body of Harvey Milk after the latter was assassinated by a deranged right-wing politician in 1978. You can see the Sean Penn movie Milk, or listen to the recent Slow Burn podcast series Gays Against Briggs, both of which cover this tragedy. Garvey was an American hero, or at least thought to be one. His playing days nickname, he had a long career ending in 1987, was Senator. Everybody assumed this clean-cut paragon of virtue would go straight into politics. California was much less of a solid blue Democratic stronghold in those days. But then the scandals came out, and it turned out that Garvey was much more a demon than a saint. Only now, in 2024, could someone like Garvey reemerge as a viable political candidate. So stay tuned to Election Day for those results, November 2024. I'm not going to say too much more about Baseball Digest, as only Melvin and Ross among my listeners that I know of are likely to have been subscribers. I will say it is the longest-running, continuous baseball publication, operated out of Chicago beginning in 1942, the same year as Little Golden Books, which started life one state to the north of Illinois in Wisconsin. Baseball Digest offered original editorials, republished articles from American newspapers, a robust letters column. Before the internet, you'd write to Baseball Digest to answer your trivia questions, running features like So You Think You Know Baseball, a rules quiz, or The Game I'll Never Forget, where second and third tier stars recounted their favorite moments on the ball field. There was an annual scouting report on rookies, there was an annual Player of the Year award, there was a World Series issue every October that gave you the history of the Fall Classic back to its 1903 origin, and tons of statistics for each season and for historical records Baseball Digest was a gold standard magazine. Incredibly, it is still in business, although it is now published every other month rather than monthly, and it's owned now by a Florida-based hedge fund. That would ordinarily mean a death sentence, but Baseball Digest must be a loss leader for them, because it is still a quality magazine. During the pandemic, they opened their vast archives for free, such that I was reading a lot of back issues online in March and April 2020. This June 1979 Baseball Digest in my Improbable library is not the original. I bought this one off eBay. The address label shows it's a Mr. Smith from Stewartstown, Pennsylvania. I read this issue so many times as a child that almost every word of the letters, pages, articles, and features were already committed to memory by the time I opened the eBay envelope last month. Now, I let my subscription lapse last year, but this little magazine is as much a part of my consciousness as Doctor Who novelizations. And I had so many baseball books. That was my last real obsession before Doctor Who, the 1982 through 1984 seasons, and the first 6 weeks of 1985 before I suddenly realized I didn't care anymore. The annual baseball handbook guides by Xander Hollander were the best. These were fat paperbacks with photos, stat lines, witty write-ups for each player, as well as sourced articles and predictions for the upcoming season. I no longer have my Xander Hollander books, but I do have, off eBay, All-Pro Baseball Stars 1984 by Bruce Weber, with a photo of Darryl Strawberry of the New York Mets, the 1983 National League Rookie of the Year, on the front cover. This is a Target-sized paperback, put out by Scholastic Books. You would order it through school magazines. The book would have been put to bed in late 1983, and its predictions for the upcoming 1984 season were terrible. Weber said the Baltimore Orioles and Chicago White Sox would win the two American League divisions just as they had done in 1983. Weber says the Pittsburgh Pirates and Atlanta Braves would win the National League divisions. I'll point out the East Coast Atlanta Braves were placed in the National League Western Division. Go ask Melvin if you want to know why that happened. Weber went 0 for 4 on his predictions. None of those teams came close to the playoffs. Weber said the Mets would finish 5th. In fairness, the book was written so early, he didn't mention Dwight Gooden once. Gooden was a 19-year-old phenom who won Rookie of the Year in '84 and set a league record for most strikeouts by a rookie pitcher before cocaine derailed his career. The Mets finished 2nd in '84 after being in first place for most of June, July, and August. Also, baseball analytics were much less developed in 1983 when Weber wrote this, so you can't blame him for getting every prediction wrong. I had bought his books for the 1983 and '84 seasons. Weber kept publishing kid-friendly baseball annuals through 1996. He was still writing nonfiction well into the 21st century. We have 3 library items left to talk about, 2 of which I have discussed often on Doctor Who literature before. There's the Choose Your Own Adventure series, which I spotlighted in my episode on the Doctor Who Find Your Fate books with my co-host for that week, Tony Witt of the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, and also the Hardy Boys books, which I talk about often. Now, I lost my Choose Your Own Adventures years ago. I have recollected most of the first 55 books in the series, and I always kept my Hardy Boys, which I now still have in my office at work, the better to save shelf space at home. I would have discovered the Hardy Boys first, my 7th birthday, which was held at a bowling alley on Long Island. You can carbon date the year that I was born based on that sentence. The first half of the party you would bowl 2 games. Now this is before bumper bowling, and I had no fine motor dexterity at that point, so I bowled 2-handed and probably rolled in the 60s in each game, if not the 50s or 40s. That's out of 300. The second hour you adjourn for lunch at a long party table in the bowling alley dining room. Uncle Herb, the same Uncle Herb who bought me the Steve Garvey Baseball Digest, bought me the Hardy Boys, books 6 and 7, respectively the Shore Road Mystery and The Secret of the Caves. The Hardy Boys were the brainchild of Edward Stratemeyer's syndicate system. The first 58 books published in cloth-bound hardcovers, roughly the same shape as the W.H. Allen Doctor Who hardcover novelizations. These had distinctive blue spines, with an oval portrait of Frank and Joe Hardy, dark-haired Frank on the left, blonde-haired Joe on the right, both in sweaters and white-collared shirts, over the black box outlined in white featuring the Hardy Boys series, printed in white text. The first 58 books were published by Grosset and Dunlap, and were all credited to Franklin W. Dixon, an in-house pen name and not a real person. We'll call him the David Agnew of New Jersey, which is where Stratemeyer had his syndicate. The first 38 books were published between 1927 and 1959, and were meant to be contemporary and inclusive. There were lots of minority characters who were friends of the Lily White Hardys, but of course these were incredibly patronizing and racist, so the first 38 books, beginning in 1959, were rewritten from scratch. Tony Prito, the Hardys' Italian friend, who used to talk like Sarah Jane Smith in The Mask of Mandragora.
Listen, I came here with you, remember? You don't have to use that 15th century double talk with me. I speak it up pretty good English.
So Tony, in the rewritten Hardy Boys novel starting in 1959, acquires an American accent, and Phil Cohen, the Hardys' one Jewish friend, presumably no longer constantly haggles over the price of inexpensive items. So my books 6 and 7 were new books, with new plots, borrowing only the names of the originals. My Secret of the Caves dates to 1964, not 1929 as the original. Honestly, I've read both now. The 1964 is much better. It's a punchy plot with fraternity boy hijinks, international espionage, sabotage, falsified identities, cryptogram ciphers. This was the book I read first. Now nowadays, Uncle Herb would have started me on books 1 and 2, not 6 and 7, and I would have read the series in order. But back then I read book 7 first. I assume because it was the book on top when I opened the package. Now I've never owned all 58 of the original hardcovers. Harriet Stratemeyer Adams, Edward's daughter, ran the syndicate by that point. She, by the way, lived on my cousin Jonathan's paper route in Essex County, New Jersey, where he grew up, before he returned, like me, from suburbia to Brooklyn. Harriet transferred the rights to the Hardy Boys away from Grosset and Dunlap to a different publisher, where the book series was downgraded to shorter paperbacks, and I never kept up. The books have gotten shorter over the years and aimed at younger and younger audiences with each new iteration, but the Hardy Boy blue spines are still a fixture in the children's section of any bookstore. There was a recent Canadian TV series aired in the States on the CW network, which rethought the series to be even more egalitarian, where the Hardy Boys' mom, Laura, who was a wet noodle in the original books, is the real driving force behind their detective genius. Frank Hardy's girlfriend in the original series was Callie Shaw, and when it was time to name my daughter, well, as I always tell her, be thankful I didn't name you after Joe Hardy's girlfriend, Iola, instead. I got my first 2 choose-your-own-adventure books while admitted to the hospital for 10 days in early 1983 for major surgery. I was 9 years old. Books 8 and 9, Deadwood City by Edward Packard, and Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, also by Packard. Packard created the series in the late 60s for his own children, and he hit publishing gold about a decade later, when publisher and editor Ray Montgomery found a deal with Bantam Books. The CYOAs are about the same size as the targets, a little bit slimmer, with a distinctive white spine format, with the series title printed in white against a red background. Packard and Montgomery wrote most of the first couple of dozen CYOAs before the now monthly series format demanded that they hire other writers to develop their notions. Most of the pathways through the books, which have about 15 to 40 endings typically, run about 9 pages long, and because this was the early 80s, about half the endings are gruesome deaths. Deadwood City is a Wild West adventure, and I think the first time I read it, lying on my hospital gurney at Long Island Jewish Hospital in Queens, hooked up to a dozen tubes, I died of rattlesnake poisoning. And then there was Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, which is an Agatha Christie homage. There's a detective named Prufrock, another literary reference I was too young to get in 1983. But if you've seen the first Knives Out movie, well, now you know where Christopher Plummer's murder victim's character got his name from. Edward Packard, by the way, is in his mid-90s, a retired attorney. He blogs about American politics every single day from a clear-eyed yet fierce perspective, and if I live to my mid-90s, that is exactly who I want to be when I grow up. I need to close this essay with a word about peanuts. When you heard that fanfare on CBS, Channel 2 in New York, you knew a Peanuts cartoon special was about to follow. When I was 7, 8, 9 years old, that was the greatest sound in the history of fanfares. Now, since about 20 years ago, when Fantagraphics republished the entire run of daily Peanuts comic strips from 1950 through 2000, the old Peanuts trade paperbacks and pocket-sized books I grew up with are obsolete. I loved Sandlot Baseball, an oversized hardcover full of curated baseball strips. I would check that out of the library regularly. Even that book serves little purpose these days, but I have to mention the novelizations of the TV specials. My first of those was the pocket-sized adaptation of It's Your First Kiss, Charlie Brown. The logo is Snoopy lying atop a TV set that says a Charlie Brown special. Charles M. Schulz is always credited as the author, and the book is impressively laid out. It's a series of illustrations taken directly from the TV special, accompanied solely by dialogue, never prose. I owned a few of these, and then checked out many more from the library. This is quite possibly, this adaptation of It's Your First Kiss, the single most important book I've ever owned. Because for years after, anytime my parents brought me to a bookstore, I would get that thrill of anticipation. My legs would turn to jelly, and I'd run, not walk, no, maybe float, not run, to the children's section to see if I could find the latest Charlie Brown TV special picture book adaptation. And when I discovered the targets in January 1985, I do it the exact same way. I get that thrill of anticipation, and my legs would turn to jelly, and I'd run, not walk. No, I would float, not run, to the sci-fi section to find my new Target novels. And when I open a Target novel today, what I'm really seeing are the pictures from those Charlie Brown books that float into my head. That is my library, my improbable library of the book obsessions that all led me from childhood to Doctor Who and the Target books and Doctor Who literature.
Toen dacht de koning, weet je wat, ik wil geen koning zijn. Ik zet mijn kroontje lekker af en trouw met roosmarijn. En zo kwam alles toch nog goed, kijk maar, dat zie je hier. Ze bleven altijd bij elkaar en hadden veel plezier.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. This week's episode was written, produced, and edited by me. Our logo was designed and our YouTube channel is run by Jim Sangster. This podcast can be found on your podcast app of choice with all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature, @gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction Point.
A Doctor Who podcast network.